I am really deeply honoured to have been asked to deliver this Stephen Livingstone Memorial Lecture. You'll never know how great an honour it is that I feel inside to have been invited. Stephen was a powerhouse for human rights by way both of intellect and character, both in this jurisdiction and those who know him far beyond as well. And he left a legacy of work in activism and in academia, which continues to be felt today. Stephen believed that respect for human rights was a necessary part in the settlement of the Northern Ireland conflict and an essential underpinning of human dignity everywhere. He worked with colleagues across the world, and particularly here with his friends in the Committee for the Administration of Justice, CAJ, indisputably one of the most important civil society organisations in these islands to make that vision a reality. So I'm really pleased to be with you today to deliver the 2024 lecture in his memory. In doing so, I hope to pay tribute not just to Stephen, but to the activists, to the people I consider to be human rights heroes, who every day take forward his vision of a just society. I want to start with a story. On Tuesday, the 10th of January 2017, a group of activists met in room 258 in Parliament buildings in Stormont. We were plotting. The last attempt to secure legislation to allow same-sex couples in Northern Ireland to marry had been foiled. Not because a majority of MLAs had voted against it. Actually, a majority had voted in favour of bringing forward legislation, but a petition of concern had been lodged to overturn the democratic will of the Chamber. Our campaign for marriage equality had won the moral victory, but the political victory, at least for now, was out of reach. Northern Ireland was being left behind on human rights again. England and Wales had legislated for same-sex marriage in 2013, Scotland in 2014, the Republic of Ireland in 2015, following a popular vote to say yes. And it was that people-powered Yes Equality campaign in the South which inspired a group of activists to establish a new campaign for marriage equality north of the border. It ultimately became the Love Equality campaign and brought together activists from the LGBTQI+ rights groups, the Rainbow Project, Cara Friend, Here NI, as well as the Irish Congress of Trade Unions, the student movement, NUS-USI, alongside Amnesty International. So 3 weeks after that referendum result was announced at Dublin Castle, tens of thousands of people come onto the streets of Belfast to demand marriage equality for Northern Ireland too. So 18 months on from that day, as we met in Parliament buildings, momentum we felt was on our side. The opinion polls showed very strong public support for law change. A concerted lobbying campaign had led to a repeated no vote in the Assembly being turned into a yes, only to have it defeated by Stormont procedure. But this only strengthened the campaign's determination for legislation. But would the Stormont institutions be up to it? Would they be able to deliver a law change that had both majority public and political support? Our plan, was to launch a marriage equality bill for the Assembly 4 weeks on from when we met, fittingly on Valentine's Day. We knew that, unlike at Westminster, at Leinster House, at Holyrood, same-sex marriage legislation would not be forthcoming from our government. It would have to come from the backbenches. Legislation would be brought forward as a private member's bill, supported by a cross-party group of MLAs from Sinn Féin, the Ulster Unionist Party, SDLP, Alliance Green Party, and People Before Profit. It was to be launched with a Valentine's Day press conference in Stormont's Great Hall with big heart-shaped balloons, the whole works. So there we were, putting together the finishing touches to our grand plans when word came through from another room in Parliament buildings. Martin McGuinness had resigned. The House of Cards had collapsed. And while we did not know it then, it would not be rebuilt, and only then on shaky foundations for another 3 years. There would be no private member's bill, no press conference in the Great Hall, no pink balloons in Stormont. In every campaign I've been involved in, though, there are moments of disappointment and sometimes even feelings of despair. It can feel like defeat is unavoidable. This is where resilience is crucial. Some might call it stubbornness. So where next for our group of activists? Well, where else but our last remaining government, the one in Westminster? So the campaign then met with secretaries of state and junior ministers and repeatedly asked them to extend the GB legislation to people in Northern Ireland. No dice, they said. That would be interfering with the devolved institutions, they said. What devolved institutions? There was no help there. So our human rights heroes, the activists from multiple organisations, the couples who entrusted the campaign with their stories to fuel public campaigning, and the thousands who year after year took to the streets to march for equality, were not going to be deterred. Described as the odd couple, we found new champions in Conor McGinn, a Labour MP originally from Crossmaglen, and Lord Robert Hayward, a lifelong Conservative and Vice President of the King's Cross Steelers, the world's first gay rugby union team. An unlikely couple indeed. That Stormont Private Members Bill, I should say, crafted by our campaign legal advisor, Kieran Moyna, many of whom you will know him. It now was to become 2 Westminster private members' bills to be introduced almost simultaneously in the Lords and the Commons. Activists from Belfast had their foot in the door in Westminster, and we were not for leaving. The bills wouldn't become law. We knew that. Private members' bills rarely do. But they provided the opportunity to lobby across both houses of Parliament. The campaign was now quietly building up support on both government and opposition benches. When we got a tip-off that the government was about to try to force a restart of Stormont with a short notice executive formation bill, an amendment was drafted for submission to the Speaker. Conor McCormick of this place, Queen's School of Law, assisted with that crucial clause. I should say gown and town collaborations are always welcome, and campaigners in this place, around this country, around this region, we have benefited hugely from many excellent working relationships with members of academic staff here at Queen's and at Ulster. And looking around this room, I see quite a few human rights defenders who have been indispensable to countless campaigns. I'm sure Stephen Livingstone would approve. In tandem with the fight for marriage equality, Amnesty and many civil society groups, from Alliance for Choice to Informing Choices NI, the former Family Planning Association, the Royal College of Midwives, and many more, had also been campaigning for abortion law reform. While Stormont's marriage ban was an affront to couples denied the right to wed, its refusal to lift a de facto blanket ban on abortion healthcare was a cruel violation of the right to healthcare. Our abortion law was largely based on the 1861 Offences Against the Persons Act. It was long past time, over 150 years on, to finally put in place a humane abortion regime. And this campaign enjoyed support from its own parliamentary champions like MPs Diana Johnson and Stella Creasy, who crucially seized the same opportunity as Conor McGinn to propose her own amendment. Predictably, though, the UK government opposed both clauses as being, as they termed it, out of scope of the bill. That's not what they had in mind at all. So it was now for much maligned Speaker John Bercow to decide order. The moment he agreed to allow both amendments to go forward. And that's the paper from that evening. The despair of 30 months earlier really was replaced with a surge of hope and adrenaline. The behind-the-scenes lobbying work on both campaigns had already been done. We thought the support was there. Surely success was now within reach. As MPs filed out to vote that evening in 2019, campaigners here waited with trepidation for the outcome. I actually happened to be in London that day for other reasons and was lucky enough then to rush down to Parliament and to end up sitting beside Robert Hayward in the Lords Gallery, which overlooks the Commons, the opposition benches in the Commons. So when MPs came back in after voting on the first clause on the Marriage Equality Amendment, Conor McGinn looked up and gave us a quick thumbs up. We knew it was in the bag. Vote count, 383 in favour, just 73 against. Less than 15 minutes later, the vote on Stella Creasy's abortion amendment, 332 in favour, 99 opposed. Success. The next day's papers, two huge victories, two slightly different takes, but anyway. Same-sex couples would finally be able to marry, and people in Northern Ireland would be able to finally access safe abortion healthcare near where they lived. The marriage equality campaign really was celebrated in style ultimately when, with Robin Peoples and Sharni Edwards becoming the first same-sex couple to marry in Northern Ireland when they wed in Carrickfergus, just ahead, again fittingly, of Valentine's Day 2020. And on their wedding day itself, with the world's media pointing cameras at them, Sharni said this to thank the activists. She said, "If it wasn't for them, guys, we wouldn't be sat here right now. We just want to say thank you to everyone who has marched and signed petitions, everyone who has helped to get us to this stage. We just want to say thank you." Of course, they were too modest, as they had become activists themselves. Maybe they didn't realise it, but they had. They had joined the marches like so many other couples during the campaign. They had also shared their love story with the media as part of the public effort to win equality for all. I think many people become what we might term accidental activists, really without planning to do so. And then they find their rights denied. One such woman was Sarah Ewart, who did so much to overturn Northern Ireland's antiquated abortion laws by telling her personal story over and over again to politicians, to the media, and finally in the courts. Sarah, with whom we had the privilege to work, never identified herself as a campaigner, instead describing herself as someone with a personal and emotional experience and a voice that spoke out. But she made an immense contribution by courageously turning her and her family's personal tragedy into a rallying call for legislative change when she was denied an abortion in Northern Ireland in 2013, in spite of doctors telling her, in spite of doctors saying that her expected baby would not survive outside the womb. After every doctor she met told her there was nothing they could do given the state of our laws, she found herself in all places but going on the Stephen Nolan show to make an appeal to political leaders to help. Spoiler alert, they didn't. Instead, she had to get on a plane to England with her husband for healthcare provided routinely in every other part of the UK. Later, she would join with a brilliant activist and Amnesty colleague, Gráinne Taggart, in the Supreme Court in an intervention in support of the Human Rights Commission's important challenge to the ban on human rights grounds. Sarah ultimately secured victory. She secured victory at the High Court in Belfast in October 2019 when the court ruled in her case that Northern Ireland's abortion law was actually in breach of the UK's human rights obligations, something we had known all along. Campaign action through the courts and in the corridors of power were now converging to secure an historic change in the law. Sarah is one of the human rights heroes we celebrate this evening. The quiet heroes who have refused to be quiet anymore, the voices that spoke out. There were many such heroes who, through marches and demonstrations, careful coalition building and years of political advocacy at Stormont and Westminster, through email actions to MLAs and online petitions to Downing Street, through strategic litigation to the Supreme Court and back again to Belfast, finally won the human rights campaigns on abortion and marriage equality. So for those campaigners in the room, you know that at the end of a campaign, you've got this thing you have to do called evaluation. Really annoying, but it's a crucial part of any campaign. So what had we actually won after all that? Essentially, equal rights to those already available to people everywhere in every other part of these islands and every other jurisdiction across the UK and Ireland. So what a slog, what an effort just to get around a dysfunctional polity at Stormont that stood in the way of equality for our people here. Imagine if such energy could be invested in making real progress rather than having to fight just to achieve equal treatment and healthcare that people in neighbouring jurisdictions take as read. Imagine having an executive that worked for equality and human rights rather than operating as a roadblock to such goals. Imagine if we could get to equality and beyond. In my lifetime, Northern Ireland has come a long way. To have grown up knowing only death and destruction on the news, to being a father of children who know nothing of that time apart from what they hear from their parents, what they learn in their history books, or perhaps, most bizarrely, what they now see on Disney+. That shows how far we have travelled in a relatively short space of time, but the promise of a human rights respecting society as set out in the 1998 agreement has only partially been met. And where we have moved forward, it has too often been despite our politicians and political structures, not because of them. While discussing the problems we have experienced in achieving better human rights outcomes in Northern Ireland, I think we must also discuss the national and global backdrop for human rights, which has been the depressing and highly relevant context to our story over the last 25 years. After the hope of the 1998 agreement, the Al-Qaeda attacks of September 11, 2001, and the response of the world's powers, including the war in Iraq and the unleashing of a so-called war on terror, marked a change for the worse in the global context, the effects of which we are still living with today. The brutal crushing of the Arab Spring, turning millions of people into refugees, led to an increasing appetite to set aside long-accepted international legal norms. Israel's war on Gaza, aided and abetted by our own government and other UN Security Council members, has further undermined the post-1945 international legal order. As the International Criminal Court prosecutor warned earlier this year, and I quote, "If we do not demonstrate our willingness to apply the law equally, if it is seen as applied selectively, we will be creating the conditions of its complete collapse. This is the true risk we face at this perilous moment." So we owe a debt of gratitude to South Africa for its courageous litigation at the ICJ and invoking international law to defend the civilians of the occupied Palestinian territory from genocide. How fitting that it should be one post-apartheid country standing up for people suffering under another apartheid system. As President Nelson Mandela remarked in 1997, we know too well that our freedom is incomplete without the freedom of the Palestinians. Professor John Morrison in his tribute to Stephen Livingstone at the service of thanksgiving and celebration of his life, noted that, and I quote again, noted that South Africa and the inspiring struggle there to transcend a legacy of oppression and mistrust by using the framework provided by the Constitution and by human rights was a particular interest in Stephen's life. South Africa also played a part in Northern Ireland's peace process. This included, in that same year of 1997, hosting a peace conference near Cape Town, where Stephen spent many times, I know, hosting a peace conference near Cape Town for the political negotiators who at that time were making pretty slow progress in castle buildings. And within weeks of the Indaba, which is the Zulu word they use for the gathering of the minds, a second IRA ceasefire was declared, and newly energized negotiations led to the political agreement of 1998. The agreement marked a huge step forward for human rights, embedding them in our constitutional settlement. The second paragraph of the Declaration of Support, which opens the agreement, declares that the protection and vindication of the human rights of all is one of the ways in which the signatories would commit themselves to a fresh start and to best honour all those who had died and been injured in the conflict. The agreement committed the UK government to the incorporation of the ECHR into Northern Ireland law and to a possible Bill of Rights, the establishment of a new Human Rights Commission, one of whose tasks was to consult and to advise on the scope for defining in Westminster legislation rights supplementary to those in the European Convention on Human Rights to reflect the particular circumstances of Northern Ireland, drawing as appropriate on international instruments and experience. And huge progress has been made with the Human Rights Act, the Human Rights Commission, the Equality Commission, a new start to policing with the PSNI Code of Ethics drawing heavily from the ECHR and other human rights instruments such as the UN Code of Conduct for law enforcement officials. The Policing Board's oversight of the police using human rights standards to measure progress and performance has been hugely important and has enjoyed the guidance of a succession of excellent human rights advisors, from Keir Starmer, whatever happened to him, to John Wadham, the present person in the role. So given such firm foundations, one might expect that progress since 1998 would have been steady and straightforward. Sadly, that has not been the case. And where progress has been secured, it has invariably been thanks to dogged and determined activism, pushing forward the realization of rights. Sometimes it feels like 2 steps forward, 1 step back. On policing, this year we have seen revelations via the Investigatory Powers Tribunal that the police have been deploying covert surveillance on journalists in an attempt to identify their sources. But not just that, but also on staff of the Office of the Police Ombudsman, the very body set up to investigate police wrongdoing. Thank you to journalists Trevor Burney and Barry McCaffrey for helping to shine a light into those dark corners. Marriage equality, like many things, took far too long to deliver here. Not because people didn't want it, they did. Poll after poll showed significant majorities in favour, cutting across the traditional green-orange divide in our politics with a big rainbow-coloured show of support, and ultimately not because the issue lacked support in the Assembly. No, it was because the mutual veto system of government meant that nothing could progress. Irish language rights campaigners have had to travel a similar, now well-worn path to Westminster to get language rights respected when Stormont proved incapable again of delivering legislation. Young and energetic activists from Dramjard campaign have filled the streets of Belfast in their thousands, calling for recognition in line with the European Charter for Regional and Minority Languages. They deserve huge credit for their campaign and ultimately for their success, so moi shiv to them. This society is a richer place for having Irish and Ulster Scots as part of our linguistic diversity. Language rights, like other rights, are not a zero-sum game. If Wales and the Republic of Ireland can be bilingual and Scotland can find public space to recognise both Scots and Scots Gaelic, why has it been such a painful struggle to have proper recognition of the indigenous languages of this place? Thankfully, activists refused to take no for an answer, and the Identity and Language Northern Ireland Act became law at Westminster in 2022. Though I note, as of today, the Executive Office has still failed to appoint the Irish Language and Ulster Scots Commissioners mandated under the law. Que ça change. Stormont has an established track record now as a barrier to the vindication of the human rights of the people who live here. The Executive Office could not even agree to appoint the panel of experts to the ad hoc committee on the Bill of Rights as envisaged in the New Decade New Approach deal. The panel had still not been appointed at the conclusion of the committee's work. So just imagine how much worse things would be now if Stormont had not collapsed all those times. So credit where it's due. But for all the wins that activists have been able to secure via the back door of Parliament, there are other issues on which neither Stormont nor Westminster have delivered for people here. But wherever I look, I see activists still fighting for change. Right now, Northern Ireland is suffering from its highest ever levels of racist hate crime. When racists ran amok in Belfast in August, attacking homes and businesses at will, it was the people of this city who came out in response. Ormeau Road residents blocked the road to defend their neighbours. People on the Donegal Road used their own bodies to physically shield a neighbour from being brutally assaulted. The community on the Falls Road responded with solidarity when their local ethnic food supermarket was targeted. Thousands of people donated to crowdfunders to support those businesses and individuals who had been attacked. Activists from groups like United Against Racism, the Annika Women's Collective, the Trade Union Movement, the Women's Movement, the LGBTQI movement took to the streets to overwhelm the small number of racists and to send a clear message. Whose streets? Our streets. It was no surprise that it was people from these activist groups who demonstrated leadership again, because they show up time after time to support each other. In the words of the March slogan, when migrant rights are under attack, what do? Stand up, fight back. When trans rights are under attack, what do? Stand up, fight back. When women's rights are under attack, what do? Stand up, fight back. Human rights activists, whatever the particular focus of their work and campaigning, understand the concept of intersectionality. We show up for each other. But we cannot do it alone, nor should we have to. We have a government with elected representatives, departments full of officials and multi-million-pound budgets, a police service with human rights central to its founding principles and its code of ethics. And they're all accountable to us. So the job of the human rights activist is not just to protest, but is to ask the difficult questions, to hold to account those with power, to take them to court when necessary, to defend those with least power, to be willing to be unpopular ourselves. And that's why I want to take this opportunity to commend the courage of the Northwest Migrants Forum, the Belfast Islamic Centre, the African and Caribbean Support Organisation NI, and the Belfast Multicultural Association. Their representatives gave evidence to the Executive Office Committee in September and challenged the legitimate concerns narrative being put forward by some politicians to explain or contextualise why people with dark skin or who pray to a different god were having their homes and businesses attacked. Dr. Naomi Green from the Belfast Islamic Centre told the committee, "It's not enough to react when hate surfaces. The underlying causes that allow it to fester must be addressed. Racism and Islamophobia intersect, and there is a long-standing failure to address either of these in NI. We know that the Executive's Racial Equality Strategy 2015 to 2025 is short on outcomes and short on resources. but key commitments made in the previous 2005 to 2010 strategy still remain undelivered, such as the introduction of ethnic equality monitoring, reform of outdated racial equality legislation, and the delivery of a refugee integration strategy. It's almost 20 years since OFM DFM made a commitment to develop a refugee integration strategy. It's still in draft form. The United Nations has noticed. Once again, this is due to the work of activists drawing attention to the problems and providing supporting evidence. In August, the UN Committee on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination published its concluding observations. They set out numerous action points for the state authorities here, including calling on, and I quote, the Government of Northern Ireland to adopt robust measures to prevent and combat paramilitary, racist violence and intimidation against ethnic minorities and migrants. The community leaders who gave evidence to the Executive Office Committee also challenged the police for their failures to properly respond to years of racially motivated hate crime, long before the upsurge of attacks in August, to which there actually has been a significant policing response. Shockingly, Beverly Simpson from the Northwest Migrants Forum told the committee, community members report being advised by the PSNI to consult, negotiate, or listen to community leaders with a link to paramilitary organisations. This is not acceptable in any democratic, peaceful society. So I ask, why does it seem acceptable in ours? 30 years after the 1994 ceasefires, we still have armed and illegal paramilitary organisations holding communities within this society hostage. So what courage these minoritised community leaders have shown in speaking up and challenging the status quo in Northern Ireland while others remain silent. What chance do we have to build a rights-respecting society in the shadow of a gunman? 25 years ago, in the wake of the agreement, Northern Ireland was actually leading the way within these islands on equality and human rights. In the intervening years, our legislation has increasingly fallen behind neighbouring jurisdictions, notwithstanding Article 2 of the Windsor Framework, which largely takes a sort of what we have, we hold defensive approach to prevent human rights protections secured in 1998 from being rolled back as a result of Brexit. The agreement held out the prospect of a Charter of Rights for the island of Ireland and an ECHR Plus statute in the shape of the Northern Ireland Bill of Rights. But the UK government of 2008 summarily dismissed the detailed recommendations submitted by our national human rights institution. Despite polling evidence of strong cross-community support for such legislation, the proposals did not have cross-party support in the Assembly. And Westminster was quick to use this as a reason to withhold support, including by introducing a new and unrealistic test for progress, which would have stopped the Good Friday Agreement itself, never mind policing reform, if it had been in place in 1998. What a missed opportunity. It's a tragedy, really. If a Bill of Rights had been enacted at the time, which properly addressed, as Amnesty and many others called for, the rights of victims of the conflict, perhaps not only could there have been much more progress towards justice and truth recovery for victims, but there could have been a significant block in the road to the passage of the wisely despised Troubles, Legacy and Reconciliation Act 2023. A missed opportunity, but not yet a lost opportunity. Both the Human Rights Commission and the Civil Society Human Rights Consortium remain strongly committed to a Northern Ireland Bill of Rights. I should note the government's other stated reason for not legislating for the bill as proposed by the Commission was that there should not be different levels of rights protection legislated for in different parts of the UK. I quote from their official response. The government's initial assessment is that over half of the rights proposed in the NIHRC's advice are equally as relevant to the people of England, Scotland and Wales as they are to the people of Northern Ireland, and therefore fall to be considered in a UK-wide context. However, in the years since the government rejected the idea of differentiated rights provision, that, of course, is exactly what has happened, and Northern Ireland has been left behind. And I want to thank Professor Colin Murray from Newcastle University for contributing some thoughts in a piece of work he's been doing for the consortium for my reflections here. The Equality Act, for instance, does not apply here. The Equality Act 2010 does not apply here, meaning some people can face discrimination that would be unlawful in other parts of the UK, for example, on the basis of age, disability, or sexual orientation. Meanwhile, devolution has led to divergent approaches to a range of rights and equality issues across the UK. So, for instance, in the last few years, legislation in Scotland and Wales has given the right to vote to 16 and 17-year-olds in local and devolved elections. On children's rights, the Rights of Children and Young People Wales Measure 2011 provided for a range of duties, including a duty on Welsh ministers to have due regard to the UNCRC's rights and obligations. The Children and Young People Scotland Act 2014 followed suit, obliging Scottish ministers to consider the UNCRC's requirements in decision-making, and the UNCRC Incorporation Scotland Act 2024, not long past, has been more ambitious, incorporating the direct text of the UNCRC to the maximum extent possible within the powers of the Scottish Parliament and imposing obligations on public authorities in Scotland. The Scottish Government has said that it sees the UNCRC Act as a first step in achieving a Scottish human rights bill. This, it says, would give effect to a wide range of internationally recognised human rights belonging to everyone in Scotland within the limits of devolved competence, and would strengthen domestic legal protections by making these rights enforceable in Scots law. In particular, the bill will seek to incorporate in Scotland ISESCR, the Convention on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, on the elimination of all forms of discrimination against women, and on the rights of persons with disabilities. The scale of ambition is really, truly welcome, although we note that recently the timescale has now slipped. That is not so welcome. In parallel, Cardiff is now developing proposals for a human rights Wales bill or incorporation of individual international treaties into Welsh law. In Northern Ireland, there is no similar drive to that seen in Holyrood and Cardiff from our Stormont executive to innovate with the incorporation of international human rights standards into Northern Ireland law. And despite 4 out of 5 main Stormont parties backing the 2022 report of the Assembly's ad hoc committee on the Bill of Rights, there is so far no sign of interest from the new UK government to taking forward the legislative work required. This is disappointing, to say the least, but it is also a new opportunity. One, I think, that would have been of immense interest to Stephen Livingstone, who was deeply interested in the constitutional interplay between the different jurisdictions on these islands, and he himself helped to establish the British-Irish Human Rights Centre network to enhance the flow of ideas on human rights among us. The incoming Irish government should fulfil its role, as is appropriate for a co-guarantor of the agreement, to support a new process to secure agreement, not just on the Northern Ireland Bill of Rights, but on the cross-border Charter of Rights. According to the most recent NI Life and Times survey, just 17% of people, 17% of people trust Stormont to any degree. 17%. I respectfully suggest that confidence in executive decision-making might be enhanced if there were evidence that it was ensuring the progressive realisation of rights such as in healthcare, housing, and addressing poverty. The recent review by the Public Accounts Committee of the Executive's Child Poverty Strategy was scathing. I quote, "We consider that delivery of the child poverty strategy has been characterised by failure. Failure to turn the curve and reduce child poverty. Failure to monitor outcomes effectively. Failure of collective working and accountability. Failure to engage with children and the community and voluntary sectors. And now a failure to produce a new anti-poverty strategy. Save the Children has characterised the executive's performance in regard to child poverty as a dereliction of duty. Of course, it does not have to be this way. And indeed, Stormont has proved that it can actually deliver on rights, on justice, when it sets aside differences to focus on the common good. The establishment of the Historical Institutional Abuse Inquiry was a brave attempt to right an historic wrong. It was as a result of a campaign led by remarkable activists such as Margaret McGuckin of Savia, John McCourt of Survivors Northwest, Jerry McCann from the Rosetta Trust, and Cyril Glass from Survivors Together. The work to establish effective accountability mechanisms for those who survive mother and baby homes, Magdalene laundries and workhouses, and separately, the scandal of clerical child abuse, that work continues. And I want to pay tribute to campaign groups such as Birth Mothers and Their Children for Justice and Truth Recovery NI, lawyers like Claire McKeegan and Kevin Winters, and academics such as Professors Patricia Lundy, Phil Scraton, Leanne McCormick, Sean O'Connell, and Dr. Maeve O'Rourke. There are many more doing the hard yards to advance this society inside and outside academia. So, it is time, once again, I would suggest, for Northern Ireland to lead the way on equality and human rights. Our system of government would benefit from improved decision-making and resource allocation within a human rights framework. More ministers at Stormont and at Hillsborough Castle should pay heed to the hard work being done elsewhere to incorporate human rights into domestic law to protect the everyday lives of people. They should listen to the experts in the field who deliver so much work in this region, from the delivery of practical services to the development of evidence-based policy to help inform better government decision-making. The activists, the campaigners, the grassroots grafters are the real heroes of this place, in my opinion. They always were. Through the Troubles, they held communities together and helped them heal post-conflict. They are the ones who never gave up on this place, never gave up on each other, and they never will. Human rights campaigning is community building because it is a fight for justice, for equality, and crucially, for all. Human rights heroes show resilience, compassion, and dedication. But ultimately, it is fundamentally, I believe, about love. It is their love for their neighbours that keeps them going, and I think inspires all of us to work harder and to keep fighting. There are always obstacles to overcome, always have been, but I have great hope. I have seen people struggle and then overcome and then win through. That work of progress is passed from one generation to the next, with today's activists standing on the shoulders of giants like Stephen Livingstone so they can see further. Stephen Livingstone left us too soon, but not before he had passed the torch to a new generation of human rights heroes. Thank you very much.